The bitter October wind howled across the Colorado plains, rattling the thin walls of Nora Campbell's weathered farmhouse on the outskirts of Silverton. She pressed her palm against the frosted window, watching her breath fog the glass as the realization settled deep in her bones. Thomas wasn't coming back this time. The note he'd left 3 days ago said that all the gold fields of California called to him more powerfully than the cries of his 5 hungry children or the devotion of his wife of 12 years. The lamp oil was running low, same as the flour bin and the children's patience. Little Sarah, just 4 years old, hadn't stopped asking when Papa would return. 8-year-old twins James and Joseph had grown sullen, while 10-year-old Elizabeth had taken to mothering 2-year-old William with a seriousness that broke Nora's heart. The winter of 1878 stretched before them like an endless frozen plain with nothing but uncertainty on the horizon. "Mama," Elizabeth's voice pulled Nora from her thoughts. "William's crying again. I think he's hungry." Nora turned from the window, forcing a smile. "We'll have supper soon, darling." "There's still some cornbread from yesterday." She didn't mention that the cornbread was the last of their food, or that the small garden out back had yielded poorly after the early frost. What would they do tomorrow? The question haunted her as she moved toward the iron stove, stoking the dying embers with the last pieces of kindling. The children gathered around the rickety table, their faces thin and expectant. Nora divided the cornbread into 6 portions, making her own the smallest. As she placed William in his chair, a knock at the door startled them all. Visitors were rare this far from town, especially as dusk approached. Nora hesitated, then reached for the shotgun Thomas had left behind, perhaps the only useful thing he hadn't taken with him. "Stay here," she instructed the children, moving cautiously toward the door. The knocking came again, more insistent. Nora gripped the shotgun tighter. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Madam, name's Matthew Lawson. I've got supplies from town." "Sheriff Mills mentioned your situation." Nora frowned. She hadn't told anyone that Thomas had left, too proud to admit that her husband had abandoned them. She cracked the door open, keeping the shotgun visible. The man on her porch stood well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and solid against the darkening sky. His dark hair curled beneath a worn Stetson, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, deep blue and startlingly kind in his weathered face. More importantly, he held a burlap sack that clearly contained food. "Sheriff Mills sent you?" Nora asked suspiciously. Matthew Lawson shifted his weight. "Not exactly, madam. I overheard him talking about a family out this way whose father had taken off. Said there were 5 little ones." He gestured to the sack. "I've got flour, beans, salt pork, and coffee. Thought you might need it." Nora's pride warred with the knowledge of her empty pantry and the 5 hungry children behind her. She tightened her grip on the shotgun. "We don't take charity, Mr. Lawson." The corner of his mouth twitched. "It's not charity if you let me stay for supper." "Been riding since dawn and could use a hot meal." His eyes held hers. "Even if it's just cornbread." The man was offering her a way to accept his help without losing her dignity. Nora hesitated, then stepped back from the door. "We don't have much to offer in return." Matthew shrugged. "A place by the fire is all I need, Mrs. Campbell, Nora Campbell." As she let the stranger into her home, Nora couldn't have known that this encounter would alter the course of her life forever. She certainly couldn't have predicted that the tall cowboy with the kind eyes would not only fill their pantry, but eventually their hearts as well. The children stared wide-eyed at the stranger who followed their mother inside. Matthew removed his hat as he entered, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Evening," he said to the children, his deep voice gentle. "Hope I'm not intruding." Elizabeth, always the protective one, moved closer to her younger siblings. "Are you here to bring our pa back?" Matthew glanced at Nora, then back to the girl. "No, miss, I'm just passing through with some extra supplies." Nora took the sack from him, her fingers trembling slightly as she felt its weight. "Children, this is Mr. Lawson. He's going to join us for supper." She carried the sack to the kitchen area, opening it to find more food than they'd had in weeks: flour, sugar, coffee, beans, salt pork, even a jar of preserved peaches. "Mama, look," James exclaimed, peering into the bag. "We can have real biscuits," Joseph added, eyes wide. Nora swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "Yes, we can." She looked up at Matthew, who was still standing awkwardly by the door. "Please sit down, Mr. Lawson. I'll get supper started." "Call me Matthew," he said, taking a seat at the edge of the bench, careful not to crowd the children. "And I meant what I said about just passing through. I've got a small ranch about 20 miles north of here. Was in town for supplies when I heard about your situation." Nora quickly set about making a proper meal, blessing the stranger's timing. Within half an hour, the small cabin was filled with the aroma of biscuits baking and salt pork frying. While she worked, Matthew somehow managed to engage all 5 children in conversation. He asked the twins about their favorite games, listened solemnly to Elizabeth's explanation of how to care for her rag doll, and even coaxed a smile from little Sarah. When William toddled over to investigate the stranger's boots, Matthew lifted him onto his knee without hesitation. "You have a way with children," Nora observed as she placed plates on the table. Matthew shrugged. "Grew up with 4 sisters, always had little ones underfoot." Supper was the most cheerful meal the Campbell household had seen in months. The children ate until they were satisfied for the first time in weeks, and even Nora allowed herself a full portion. As she cleared the dishes afterward, Matthew spoke quietly. "Mrs. Campbell, I don't mean to pry, but how long has your husband been gone?" Nora stiffened. 3 days. "But he's done this before, never for more than a week or 2. Matthew nodded, watching as the children played on the floor nearby. "And has he ever left you without supplies before winter?" "No," she admitted, "but he'll be back. He always comes back." Matthew didn't argue, but something in his expression told Nora he wasn't convinced. "It'll be dark soon," he said instead. "I should be on my way." The thought of him leaving, taking his steady presence and the security he'd brought to their home, made Nora's chest tighten unexpectedly. "You said you've been riding since dawn," she found herself saying. "It's too dark to travel safely now. We have a shed out back where you could sleep. It's not much, but there's clean straw." Matthew studied her face. "You sure about that? I'm a stranger to you and your children." "A stranger who brought us food when we had none," Nora replied. "I think I can trust you not to murder us in our sleep, Mr. Lawson." For the first time, she saw him smile, fully a warm expression that transformed his face and crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Much obliged, then." "And it's Matthew, remember." That night, after the children were asleep, Nora sat alone by the dying fire. The house felt different somehow, as if Matthew's presence just outside had changed something fundamental about their situation. She told herself it was simply the relief of having food in the pantry again, of knowing her children wouldn't go hungry tomorrow. But as she banked the fire and prepared for bed, she found herself wondering about the quiet cowboy who had appeared on her doorstep like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to speak. Morning arrived with a fresh dusting of snow and the unexpected sound of chopping wood. Nora rose quickly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders as she peered out the window. Matthew Lawson stood in the yard, systematically reducing a fallen tree limb to usable firewood. She watched him work for a moment, his breath clouding in the cold air, his movements efficient and purposeful. When she finally stepped outside, he paused, axe in mid-swing. "Good morning, Mrs. Campbell." "You didn't have to do that," she said, nodding toward the growing pile of firewood. "Seemed like you were running low." He brought the axe down, splitting another log cleanly. "And I always pay for my lodging." With a night in a drafty shed, Matthew grinned, the expression warming his features. "Best sleep I've had in weeks. Your children make fine company, too." As if summoned by his words, the cabin door opened and the twins burst out, followed more sedately by Elizabeth with William on her hip. Sarah lingered in the doorway, thumb in her mouth. "Mr. Lawson, are you staying for breakfast?" James asked eagerly. Matthew glanced at Nora, his expression questioning. She found herself nodding before she had consciously decided, "If your mother doesn't mind." "I was just about to start the biscuits," Nora said. "There's plenty." And so it went. Breakfast stretched into morning, and when Matthew mentioned he needed to check his horse, the twins begged to come along. One thing led to another, and suddenly he was showing them how to brush down the animal, teaching them about proper care. By noon, he had helped Elizabeth draw water from the well, fixed a loose board on the porch, and begun teaching Sarah how to whistle. William followed him everywhere, occasionally raising his arms to be lifted. Nora watched it all with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Why was this man, a stranger until yesterday, doing so much for them? And why did she find herself hoping he wouldn't leave too soon? "Your husband," Matthew said quietly as they stood side by side shelling beans for the midday meal. "Is he a miner?" Nora kept her eyes on her work. "He was. That's how we ended up here. But the Silverton mines haven't been producing like they used to. Thomas kept saying there was more opportunity elsewhere. So he went looking." Yes. She didn't mention the drinking, the rages when money was tight, the promises he never kept. "He'll be back when he finds something." Matthew was silent for a long moment. "And if he doesn't," Nora looked up then, meeting his gaze directly. "Then we'll manage, we always have." Something flickered in his eyes, respect, perhaps, or admiration. "I believe you would, Mrs. Campbell." He set down his bowl of beans. "But winter's coming on hard. That roof needs patching before the heavy snows, and your woodpile should be twice as big, Mr. Lawson." Matthew, she conceded. "You've done more than enough." "We're grateful, but I've got a proposition," he interrupted. "I need to head back to my ranch tomorrow, check on things, but I could come back after, stay a few days, help get this place ready for winter." He held up a hand when she began to protest. "In exchange for meals." "My cooking's terrible, and eating with your family would be a fair trade." Nora studied him suspiciously. "Most men don't consider cooking a fair trade for carpentry and heavy labor." Matthew shrugged. "I'm not most men." His expression grew serious. "Look, Mrs. Campbell, I've got no right to interfere in your life. If your husband comes back tomorrow, I'll tip my hat and ride away. But those children in there need warmth and security for the winter, and you can't do everything yourself." His words stung with truth. Nora had been trying not to think about the leaky roof, the insufficient woodpile, all the tasks Thomas should have completed before he left. 2 days, she said finally. "You can stay 2 days to help with the roof and the woodpile, then we're even." Matthew nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. 2 days it is. He left the following morning as promised, but not before stacking more firewood, securing a loose shutter, and giving each child a small carved wooden animal he had apparently worked on after they went to bed. "I'll be back day after tomorrow," he told Nora as he mounted his horse. "Got some tools we'll need for the roof." Nora stood with the children, watching him ride away. Only when he had disappeared over the rise did she realize how much emptier the homestead felt without him. The next day and a half passed slowly. The children asked repeatedly when Mr. Lawson would return, and even Nora found herself watching the road more often than necessary. She told herself it was simply because another adult presence made the burden lighter, nothing more. But when she spotted his figure approaching on the second day, right on schedule, the leap in her heart suggested something else entirely. Matthew arrived with saddlebags full of supplies: nails, tar paper for the roof, more food, and even small gifts for the children. A bag of candy sticks, a set of jacks for the twins, a small picture book for Elizabeth, and a rag ball for the younger ones. "You didn't need to bring gifts," Nora said as the children exclaimed over their treasures. "Wanted to," he replied simply. "My mama always said visitors shouldn't arrive empty-handed." They settled into a rhythm over the next 2 days. Matthew worked from dawn till dusk, patching the roof, cutting more firewood, and fixing everything he could find that needed repair. Nora cooked and kept the children occupied, occasionally helping with tasks that required an extra pair of hands. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire while the children played or listened to Matthew's stories of cattle drives and frontier adventures. He had a way of telling tales that captivated even William, and Nora found herself equally enthralled by his deep voice and the faraway places he described. On the evening of the second day, with the promised work completed, Matthew sat at their table for what should have been his final meal with them. The children were subdued, aware that their new friend would be leaving. "Will you come back and visit us, Mr. Lawson?" Sarah asked as Nora cleared the dishes. Matthew glanced at Nora before answering. "If your ma says it's all right, I could stop by now and then to make sure everything's holding up." 5 pairs of eyes turned to Nora expectantly. She hesitated, conscious of propriety, of the talk that might start if a single man made regular visits to a married woman's home, husband present or not. "Perhaps occasionally," she said carefully. "When you're passing through." Matthew nodded, understanding the boundary she was setting. Later, as she walked him to the shed where he'd been sleeping, he spoke quietly. "Mrs. Campbell, there's something I need to say." Nora tensed, suddenly afraid of what might follow. "I've been in town asking around. Your husband was seen boarding a stage to Denver, not heading to California. And he was traveling with a woman." The words hit Nora like a physical blow. She had suspected Thomas might not return this time, but the confirmation of betrayal still stung sharply. "I see," she managed. "I'm sorry," Matthew said gently. "I thought you should know." Nora nodded, unable to speak for the tightness in her throat. She turned to go back to the house, but Matthew's voice stopped her. "One more thing. The sheriff mentioned your husband had debts in town, quite a few of them. The mercantile, the saloon, even the livery." Nora closed her eyes briefly. Of course, Thomas would leave her not only with 5 children to feed, but with his unpaid debts as well. "Thank you for telling me," she said stiffly, pride keeping her spine straight despite the crushing weight of this new knowledge. Matthew stepped closer, his expression earnest in the dim light from the cabin windows. "I'd like to help, Mrs. Campbell, not charity, mind you. I need someone to keep house at my ranch for the winter. Cooking, cleaning, looking after things. The place is big enough for all of you, and the children would be safe and warm." Nora stared at him in disbelief. "You're offering me a job with room and board for all of you," he confirmed. "The ranch is isolated, but it's solid and well-stocked. There's a good school within riding distance for the older ones come spring." "Why would you do this? You barely know us." Matthew looked away for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "My sister was left in a similar situation a few years back. 3 children, no money, middle of winter. A neighbor helped her when no one else would." His eyes met Nora's again. "I'm just passing along the kindness." The offer was tempting more than tempting, but Nora hesitated. "What if Thomas comes back looking for us? Anyone in town can direct him to my place," Matthew said. "And if he comes with honest intentions to support his family, you're free to go with him." He paused. "But given what I've heard, I don't think that's likely to happen." Nora knew he was right. Thomas had never been reliable, even in the best of times. And now, with evidence he had left with another woman, the chances of his return were slim to none. "I need to think about it," she said finally. Matthew nodded. "Of course. I'll be heading back tomorrow, but the offer stands. Anytime this winter, you just send word to the Lone Pine Ranch with anyone traveling north, and I'll come fetch you all." That night, Nora lay awake long after the children had fallen asleep, weighing her options. Stay here and face certain hardship, possibly starvation if the winter proved harsh. Try to make it to town and find work there, though who would hire a woman with 5 young children? Or accept Matthew Lawson's offer, which seemed almost too good to be true. By morning, she had made her decision. When Matthew came in for breakfast, she waited until the children were occupied before speaking. "Your offer," she began, keeping her voice low. "Does it still stand?" Relief flooded his features. "Yes, madam, it does." "Then we accept, but I need a few days to pack our things and say goodbye to this place." Matthew nodded. I'll come back for you all on Saturday. 4 days enough. Yes, Nora said, surprised by the calm certainty she felt. That should be perfect. The next 4 days passed in a flurry of activity. Nora sorted through their meager possessions, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. She had the children help clean the cabin from top to bottom, explaining they were going on an adventure to Mr. Lawson's ranch for the winter. But what about Papa? Sarah asked, her small face troubled. How will he find us? Nora knelt beside her daughter. Mr. Lawson will leave word in town so Papa can find us if he comes back. But for now, we need to go somewhere warm and safe for the winter. On Saturday morning, they stood ready with their bundles when Matthew arrived driving a wagon instead of riding his horse. Thought this would be more comfortable for everyone, he explained as he helped load their belongings. The children climbed aboard eagerly, excited by the prospect of a journey and a new place to explore. Only Nora hesitated, looking back at the small cabin that had been their home for the past 3 years, having second thoughts. Matthew asked quietly. Nora shook her head. No. Just saying goodbye. The journey to Lone Pine Ranch took most of the day. As they traveled north, the landscape changed subtly, more trees, less open plain, the distant mountains seeming closer and more majestic. The children pointed out jackrabbits and deer, their voices bright with excitement. By late afternoon, Matthew turned the wagon onto a long drive marked by twin pine trees. Almost there, he told them, pointing ahead to where a sprawling log house stood nestled against a hillside, smoke curling from its chimney. Nora stared in surprise. She had expected a modest cabin, perhaps slightly larger than their own. What she saw instead was a substantial home with a wide porch, multiple windows, and several outbuildings nearby. A corral held several horses, and in the distance, she could make out cattle grazing on the hillsides. You live here alone? She asked. Matthew nodded. Built it thinking I'd have a family someday. Turns out it's a bit much for just one man. As they approached, the front door opened and an older woman stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. That's Mrs. Gunderson, Matthew explained. She comes in from town once a week to help with cleaning and such. I asked her to prepare for your arrival. Mrs. Gunderson greeted them warmly, her round face beaming as she ushered them inside. The interior of the house was as impressive as its exterior, spacious rooms with solid furniture, a massive stone fireplace, and a kitchen that made Nora's eyes widen with appreciation. I've made up rooms for everyone, Mrs. Gunderson explained, leading them upstairs. The boys can share, and the girls too, with the little one in with his mama. Nora followed in a daze as the woman showed them to clean, comfortable bedrooms with real beds and warm quilts. The children exclaimed over the space and comfort, bouncing experimentally on mattresses softer than anything they'd slept on before. It's too much, Nora said to Matthew when they returned downstairs. We can't possibly accept all this. You're earning your keep, remember? He replied easily. Besides, these rooms have been empty too long. They need the sound of children in them. That evening, they shared a hearty meal prepared by Mrs. Gunderson before she departed for town. After the children were tucked into their new beds, marveling at the luxury of their surroundings, Nora joined Matthew by the fire in the main room. I still don't understand why you're doing this, she said quietly. The story about your sister is completely true, he finished for her. But yes, there's more to it. He stared into the flames for a long moment before continuing. I've been alone a long time, Mrs. Campbell. Built this place, built the ranch, but there's not much purpose to it without people to share it with. So we're charity after all. Matthew shook his head. No, you're bringing something I need as much as you need what I'm offering. A household needs a woman's touch, children's laughter. I've got the means to provide, but not the family to provide for. He looked at her directly. It's a fair exchange, I think. Nora considered his words. There was no impropriety in his manner, no suggestion of anything beyond the arrangement they had discussed. Yet she couldn't help wondering if there might someday be more between them than a simple exchange of services. We'll see how the winter goes, she said finally, one day at a time. As the days turned into weeks, the Campbell family settled into life at Lone Pine Ranch. The children thrived in their new environment, the twins helping Matthew with chores around the ranch, Elizabeth learning to cook from Nora and Mrs. Gunderson, Sarah and William growing rosy-cheeked and sturdy with proper food and care. Nora found her days full but satisfying. The spacious house was a pleasure to maintain compared to their cramped cabin, and Matthew provided everything they needed without hesitation. He was gone much of the day, working with his cattle and horses, but evenings were spent together around the table or by the fire. As November turned to December, Nora realized with surprise that she had not thought of Thomas in days. The pain of his betrayal had faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of their new life. Matthew never mentioned him, never asked if she had heard any news from town. It was as if they had made a tacit agreement to look forward, not back. One evening, as the first heavy snow of winter blanketed the land, Matthew returned from the barn with a mysterious burlap sack. "What's that?" James asked eagerly, always the first to spot anything new. Matthew winked at the boy. "Christmas is coming. Thought we might need a tree." The children erupted in excitement. At their old home, Christmas had been a modest affair, perhaps a small gift for each child if Thomas had been working, a special meal if they could afford it. The idea of a proper Christmas tree seemed magical. "Can we decorate it tonight?" Joseph begged. "First we need to set it up," Matthew said, pulling pine boughs from the sack. "I'll make a stand and we can use these to create a tree. Tomorrow we'll start on decorations." The next few days were filled with Christmas preparations. Matthew showed the children how to string popcorn and cranberries, carve simple wooden ornaments, and make paper chains. Nora baked gingerbread and sugar cookies, filling the house with spicy, sweet aromas that made everyone's mouths water. On Christmas Eve, with the children finally asleep after hours of excitement, Nora and Matthew sat alone by the fire. Outside, snow fell steadily, insulating the house in a blanket of silence. "Thank you," Nora said softly, watching the flames dance. "For all of this. The children haven't been this happy in, I can't remember how long." Matthew smiled, the firelight casting warm shadows across his face. "Seeing them happy is thanks enough. It's been a lonely place without children's voices." Nora studied him thoughtfully. "You never married?" "Almost once." "She changed her mind," he shrugged. "Decided ranch life was too isolated, too hard. Can't say I blame her. I'm sorry. Don't be. If things had gone differently, you and your children wouldn't be here now." He met her gaze directly. "And I've come to value your presence more than I can say." The warmth in his eyes made Nora's heart beat faster. In the 3 months since Thomas had left, she had not allowed herself to think of another man that way, but something had changed in these weeks at Lone Pine Ranch. Matthew Lawson had become more than a benefactor, more than an employer. "I should check on the children," she said, suddenly uncomfortable with the direction of her thoughts. Matthew nodded, understanding in his expression. "Of course. Big day tomorrow." Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the world outside transformed into a dazzling white landscape. The children woke early, their excited voices carrying through the house as they discovered the small gifts Matthew had placed under their makeshift tree, wooden toys he had carved himself, candy sticks, a new hair ribbon for Elizabeth, a tiny rag doll for Sarah. For Nora, there was a beautiful shawl, finely woven and softer than anything she had owned before. "Matthew, it's too much," she protested when she unwrapped it. "It was my mother's," he said simply. "She'd want someone to use it, not have it sitting in a trunk." The day passed in a blur of celebration. They enjoyed a feast of roast goose, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie. The children played with their new toys, and even Matthew seemed more relaxed than Nora had ever seen him, joining in their games and telling stories of Christmases from his own childhood. As January settled in with bitter cold and short days, life at Lone Pine Ranch fell into a comfortable routine. Matthew taught the older children to ice skate on a frozen pond near the house, and showed them how to identify animal tracks in the snow. Nora expanded her cooking repertoire with ingredients she'd never had access to before, delighting in Matthew's appreciation of her efforts. In the evenings, Matthew often read aloud from one of the many books that filled a shelf in the main room. The children would listen, enthralled, while Nora mended or knitted by the fire. These quiet moments, with the family gathered together in the warm circle of lamplight, became precious to all of them. One night in late January, after the children were asleep, Matthew broached a subject they had both been avoiding. Mrs. Campbell, Nora, he began, using her first name for the first time. There's something I need to discuss with you. Nora set aside her mending, a sense of foreboding settling over her. Is something wrong? No, not wrong exactly. He cleared his throat. I received word from Sheriff Mills yesterday. Your husband's debts in town, I've paid them. Nora stared at him in shock. You what? Why would you do that? Because they were holding your cabin as collateral. If the debts weren't settled, they'd have seized it come spring. He held up a hand as she began to protest. I know you're proud, and I respect that. Consider it a loan if you want, but I couldn't let you lose your home in case we leave here, Nora finished quietly. Matthew nodded, his expression carefully neutral. The arrangement was for the winter. When spring comes, you might want to return to your own place. I wouldn't stop you. Nora was silent for a long moment, considering his words. The thought of returning to the small cabin, struggling alone to support 5 children, filled her with dread. But more than that, the idea of leaving Matthew his kindness, his steady presence, the way he had become essential to all of them, that was what truly troubled her. The children are happy here, she said finally. Happier than they've been in years. And you? Matthew asked, his voice low. Nora met his gaze. I am too. Something shifted in his eyes, hope perhaps, or relief. Then stay, not as my housekeeper, but as… He hesitated. I know it's too soon. Your husband's only been gone a few months, but I care for you, Nora, for all of you. And if someday you might consider, Matthew, she interrupted gently. Thomas and I hadn't truly been husband and wife in a long time, even before he left, and what you've done for us, the way you are with the children. She took a deep breath. I care for you too, very much. The smile that spread across his face made him look younger, almost boyish. Then we have time to see where this leads. No hurry, no pressure. As February gave way to March, the first signs of spring appeared: patches of bare ground where the snow had melted, the return of birdsong in the mornings, longer days filled with increasing warmth. With the changing season came a shift in Nora and Matthew's relationship as well. It began with small gestures, his hand lingering on hers when passing a dish at dinner, her preparing his favorite meals more often, the two of them sitting closer together in the evenings. The children noticed, of course. Elizabeth asked outright one day if Mr. Lawson was going to be their new father. Would that bother you? Nora asked carefully. Elizabeth considered the question with the seriousness of her 10 years. No, he's nicer than Pa ever was, and he makes you smile, Mama. In late March, a letter arrived from Silverton, forwarded by Sheriff Mills. Nora recognized Thomas's handwriting immediately, though it was messier than usual, the words slanting across the page as if written in haste or intoxication. She read it alone in her room, her hands trembling slightly. Thomas was in California after all, having parted ways with the woman he'd left with. He wrote of striking it rich any day now, of sending for them when he had enough money. But there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the hardship he had caused. Just vague promises she'd heard too many times before, followed by a request that she send money for his investment opportunity if she could spare it. Nora folded the letter carefully and placed it in her drawer. That evening, she showed it to Matthew. He wants you to send him money, Matthew said incredulously after reading it, after leaving you and 5 children to starve. That's Thomas, Nora said simply. Always chasing the next big strike, the next game, the next woman. Matthew studied her face. Does his letter change anything for you? No. Her answer came without hesitation. I know now what a real partnership can be, what a real home feels like. I won't go back to that life, and I won't subject my children to it either." Relief flooded Matthew's expression. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I've been wanting to ask you something, but wasn't sure if it was too soon." Nora's heart quickened. "Ask me now." "I love you, Nora Campbell. I love your children as if they were my own. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to Nora's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." They were married on a perfect day in May 1879, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows around Lone Pine Ranch. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by Mrs. Gunderson, Sheriff Mills and his wife, and a few of Matthew's neighboring ranchers. The children participated enthusiastically, Elizabeth and Sarah scattering flower petals, the twins standing proudly beside Matthew as his best men, and William carrying the rings on a small pillow, coached carefully by his older siblings. As Nora spoke her vows, looking into Matthew's steady blue eyes, she felt the final shadows of her past life falling away. Here was a man who had brought food when they were hungry, shelter when they were vulnerable, and love when they needed it most. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the circuit preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride." Matthew's kiss was gentle but filled with promise. Around them, the children cheered, and Nora knew that this moment marked not just a new beginning for her, but for all of them. That evening, after a celebratory feast, and when the children were finally asleep, Nora and Matthew stood together on the porch of what was now truly their home. The spring air was sweet with the scent of pine and new growth, the stars blazing overhead in a clear sky. "Happy, Mrs. Lawson?" Matthew asked, his arm around her waist. Nora leaned into his embrace. "More than I ever thought possible." The children seemed to be adjusting well to the idea. She laughed softly. "They adjusted months ago. James told me today he's known since Christmas that you would be their new pa." Matthew smiled. Smart boy. His expression grew more serious. "I want to adopt them formally, give them my name. Would you be agreeable to that?" Nora turned to face him, touched beyond words by his desire to make her children legally his own. "I would be honored." "They already think of you as their father." "And I think of them as my children," he said simply. "All 5 of them." The years that followed brought changes and challenges, as all years do, but the foundation of love and trust that Nora and Matthew had built proved unshakable. In the spring of 1880, Thomas Campbell's body was found in a mining camp outside Sacramento, the victim of a dispute over cards. Nora mourned briefly for the man he might have been, but her life had moved so far beyond him that the news felt like it belonged to another lifetime. That same year, she gave birth to a son they named Daniel, a strong, healthy boy with Matthew's blue eyes and his mother's determination. 2 years later, twin girls joined the family, Rebecca and Rachel, completing their household with joyful chaos. The older children thrived under Matthew's guidance. The twins, James and Joseph, learned ranching from the ground up, eventually taking over more responsibility as the operation grew. Elizabeth developed a talent for teaching and began helping at the small school that had been established 5 miles away. Sarah revealed an unexpected gift for music when Matthew brought home a piano one Christmas, while William proved to have his stepfather's knack with animals. Lone Pine Ranch prospered as the years passed, growing into one of the most successful operations in the region. Matthew's fair dealing and hard work earned him the respect of everyone who knew him, while Nora became known for her hospitality and the tight-knit family she and Matthew had created. On a golden autumn afternoon in 1888, 10 years after Matthew had first appeared at her door with a sack of food, Nora stood on the porch watching her family. The older boys were breaking horses in the corral, their skill evident in every movement. Elizabeth sat under a nearby tree reading to the younger children, while Matthew supervised William's first attempts at roping a practice post. The sound of laughter floated across the yard as Daniel, now 8, made some joke that sent his sisters into fits of giggles. Nora smiled, remembering the desperate woman she had been a decade earlier with no hope and no future beyond day-to-day survival. Matthew looked up, catching her eye across the yard. Even after all these years, his smile still made her heart beat faster. He excused himself from the roping lesson and walked toward her. "Penny for your thoughts," he said as he joined her on the porch. "I was just thinking how different things might have been," she replied, "if you hadn't shown up that day with food for 5 hungry children." Matthew slipped his arm around her waist. "Best decision I ever made, stopping at your door. We've been blessed," Nora agreed, leaning against his solid strength. "Every one of us." "You know what today is?" he asked. Nora nodded. 10 years since you first came to our cabin." "I remember every detail. I've got something for you." Matthew reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, ordered it special from Denver. Inside was a delicate gold locket. When Nora opened it, she found a tiny portrait of all 8 children on one side and Matthew on the other, expertly painted in miniature. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Matthew clasped it around her neck. "Not half as beautiful as the life you've given me." He kissed her gently. "I came bringing food, but you gave me a family, Nora. Everything I have that matters is because of you." "We gave it to each other," she corrected, touching the locket that rested against her heart. "And that's why it will last forever." As the sun set over Lone Pine Ranch, casting long shadows across the land they had nurtured together, Nora Lawson knew that what had begun in desperation had transformed into the greatest blessing of her life. The cowboy who had brought food when they were hungry had indeed stayed forever, building with her a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. And in the laughter of their children, in the strength of their bond, in the home they had created together, Nora found the answer to a question she had stopped asking long ago. This, at last, was what happiness truly meant.